Andrew, in a nutshell, has encapsulated the political strategy of this party, the leadership strategy of this party, and the whole strategic aim of our development. And he's right in a way that we're all reluctant leaders. We would all prefer someone else to be doing this. I would prefer to be sitting where you are at this precise moment in time. But we have to act as a catalyst, because many of us have been involved in politics for years, decades even. And as we move through the agenda, you'll understand how we see ourselves moving forward, the statement of intent that we intend to make today through this gathering. I want to hand you over to the next speaker, who's Jim Luthwaite, who was a former BNP councillor in Bradford. So Jim actually went that extra mile and got himself elected, which is no mean feat. Believe me, as someone who stood for election on numerous occasions. Jim then left the BNP and set up the Democratic Nationalists, which amalgamated with our party in the last 12 months. So please, a warm hand for Jim Luthwaite from Bradford. Thank you very much.
I'd like to apologise because this isn't prepared. I didn't know I was going to be speaking when I set off this morning when Andrew Bronze gave me a lift. I think I'm filling in for somebody that's dropped out. There are two things I'd like to concentrate on. One is, where are our supporters to be found? Having stood on numerous Labour Party supporters' doorsteps in Bradford South and tried futilely to convince them of the virtues of nationalism, I know that you can knock down every single issue and then say, well, Mr. Smith, can I count on your vote for the nationalists? And be told, no, I'm a Labour voter. I think this is part of a wider problem, which is our voters are not going to be found by converting members of existing majority so-called parties to our cause. It's banging your head against a brick wall, and it's unnecessary. 2/3 of the electorate in local elections normally don't vote at all. And yet, I would bet that they would agree with us on most points. In other words, the problem is not one of convincing Labour, Tory, Liberal, or even UKIP voters to vote nationalist, because that's an uphill struggle. It's of convincing people who think the whole political game is utterly rotten and corrupt, and will be thinking so even more so after the recent Flowers controversy. They will basically say, I'm not interested in politics because it's such a dirty business that I do not even want to stagger as far as the polling booth and vote. It's a different problem to try to convince those people that their views are sound and that it is worthwhile voting, because then it follows that they will vote for us. It's a different battle from the one we normally fight, where we try to essentially, like everybody else, rubbish other parties and build up our own. Rather than doing that, what we need to do is to reinterest people in politics at all, because they've basically given up on the whole game. They would rather stay in and watch the TV or go down the pub. They do not believe that participating in the electoral game has anything to offer them. And yet, there are more of them than all the other party supporters put together. And we can safely predict that there will be even fewer party supporters in May, because in all major parties there's been a decline in membership and activists are losing morale hand over fist. In other words, our great attraction, which is that we've got highly motivated activists, can be used as a weapon for once. What we're lacking, obviously, is resources and other things, but this is more than made up for by the fact that our candidates are normally very well known locally. And if, as Andrew and Kevin were suggesting, we don't try and overreach ourselves and concentrate on a few wards where we're strong, rather than on having the maximum number of candidates, then that feature will redound to our advantage. So, as far as I'm concerned, it's not a matter of defeating other parties as a matter of defeating what is often mistaken for apathy and indifference, but is nothing of the sort. When you talk to these people on the doorsteps who do not want to vote, they are anything but apathetic and indifferent. They are seething with fury. What they don't believe is that that fury will find an outlet through the voting box. So that's what we have to convince them is worth doing. In other words, it's Operation White Vote. It's getting those people off their backsides and into the polling booths. But that is actually something which the other parties will not be trying to do, because at the moment, with the media behind them, the situation of the present day, where most people don't vote, is to their advantage. They have no reason to rock that particular boat. The second thing I wanted to talk about is British jobs for British workers leave the European Union. I spoke at Preston suggesting, rather like item 1, the proposed amendment, that we modify that and that we actually try and not leave the Union, but turn the Union to our advantage. It affects both those policies because you cannot argue for British jobs for British workers under EU laws unless you leave the European Union. We have to leave the EU in order to be able to safeguard our jobs for our workers. Equally, if we stay in the EU, then we have to look again at that policy, British jobs for British workers. We have to modify it in some way. We know what we want, but we might have to rephrase it. You have to start, I'm convinced, with a vision and a strategy. You can then work out what tactics are appropriate in the light of circumstances. And the circumstances which are propitious for stopping in the European Union at the moment are the tremendous success of the Front National and other parties across Europe. Some of them are not as conspicuous as the Front National, but they've nevertheless achieved a high degree of influence on the politics of their countries. The Danish People's Party is not in the ruling coalition, but no legislation goes through the Danish Parliament unless the DPP approves it. It pulls strings from behind the scene. In Switzerland, the fourth party in the coalition is the equivalent to the BNP, the Volkspartei. In other countries like Holland and Belgium, the nationalist parties are the second or third largest, particularly in regional areas like Flanders. The Front National are knocking at the doors of power, and given the economic collapse which threatens France at any moment, it is more than likely that a conservative nationalist coalition will eventually emerge. Do we want to turn our backs on all this success when we ourselves are struggling, or is it not a source of strength rather than weakness? If so, we have to rethink and renegotiate what we want to achieve and how we want to achieve it. We are at the foot of an electoral ladder which might take a decade or more to overcome, and we haven't got that time. So if we struggle on our own, from parish councils to district councils to an MP, and no nationalist has ever yet been elected an MP in all the time that nationalists have been fighting elections, and so on and so forth, we will face an enormous uphill struggle. But what if we can bring European leverage to our advantage? What I have in mind is that the EU can pass laws which would be incumbent on the British government, which we cannot. Now, most nationalists would instinctively say, but I don't want to be dictated to by the politicians in Brussels. What we have to swallow, the bitter pill we have to swallow, is that this might be to our advantage. In other words, it might be strategically unwelcome in the short run, but tactically useful in getting us towards our goal. What I'm imagining is something like an EU-wide legislation saying no burqas, no halal meat to be sold or distributed in the EU, no more minarets to be erected on local planning grounds, etc. That could be done if a majority of 28 nations, many of which don't have Muslim minorities or have bitter memories of wars with Muslims in the past, think of the Balkans and as far east as you can go, these countries have nothing to lose and everything to gain by coming into some sort of agreement with us to propose a blanket ban on what you might call Muslim activity, pushing Islamism forward. In all cases, some sort of local deal could be done because they have other issues which they would be willing to trade off for such legislation. But to do that, we have to have representatives in Brussels. We cannot simultaneously say, we don't believe it's worth having MEPs, when in fact we have succeeded in the past as nationalists in getting 2 MEPs elected, but never to get somebody into Westminster. We may look at the fact that, of course, with the proportional representation system, MEPs are the one thing we might get elected fairly easily. But we've got to give that MEP a clear direction as to what he is in Brussels to do. And that should be to form the widest possible confraternity of fellow nationalists to get specific legislation put forward which would put the British government in a difficult position. Until this day, the British government can comfortably accommodate both being pro-European and pro-multicultural, multiracialist, because the two are perceived as being not in conflict. What we've got to do is to force them to choose between one and the other, knowing that will be a very difficult decision for the likes of Cameron and Clegg and Miliband, who are wedded to the idea of Europe. What we have to do is to confront them with a vision of Europe, or a reality of Europe, which is quite different from what they set out to achieve. Instead of being a liberal left-wing Europe, it could be a right-wing and nationalist Europe. That could come about if our colleagues in Europe succeed, and it looks very much as if that is going to happen. They don't have to rule Europe, they merely have to be such a strong pressure group they cannot be ignored, and that is within reach. It has been suggested that the latest welding together of European nationalists could be the 4th biggest grouping within Europe. It could, in other words, have the balance of power in voting measures. If we can contribute towards that in any way, then we could put the British government in a situation where it either has to ask for exemption from some European-wide legislation, or even the British government might want to leave EU altogether. That is not something which is going to be welcome to the establishment. At this point, we have to ask ourselves, what are our rivals and what are our enemies? UKIP is a rival, and UKIP is busy pushing leave the EU because it knows that deep within every Englishman there is a desire to have a sort of Little Englander status separate from Europe, separated by the Channel, charting our own destiny. They know that they have a safe default position in basically saying we don't want any more legislation affecting internal UK affairs about bent bananas or any other interference. At the moment, we know that 80% of legislation which goes through the House of Commons is simply rubber stamping EU proposals. It is not difficult, therefore, for UKIP to appeal to this sense of being put upon by Brussels. However, our real enemies are not UKIP. Our real enemies are the global capitalists. In fact, UKIP is the 4th wing of the great political cartel that is in favour of global capitalism. If you read between the lines of what Farage is arguing for, he's not arguing for us to turn our backs on multinationals. He wants to push forward multinationalism. He just wants to wave smoke and mirrors in people's eyes by concentrating on Polish builders and the rest of it to distract them from the fact that he is just as wedded to, if not more wedded to, multinational global capitalism, which means essentially a poor future for us all, low wage rates for everybody in the long run. It's just that he's disguising that fact by concentrating on a very visible and obvious target, e.g. Romanian, Bulgarian, Polish cheap labour now. But the long-term vision of the Faragists is just as threatening to the rest of us as that of the Tories, the Liberals or Labour. It is in fact indistinguishable. We have to bring this out. We have to point out that for a real long-term future of a UK as a member of a European family of white Christian nations in which there will be a reasonable standard of living for all to be achieved by keeping work as far as possible within Europe, we have to go for a system of European, rather than perhaps UK, job preferences. We have to think through what this vision would translate as in terms of legislation, and we have to get people elected to Brussels to make our contribution towards seeing that vision realised. The advantage of this, of course, will be it'll be different from what nationalists have been arguing for in the past, and it will be unexpected in that our enemies will not see it coming. That we will not get anywhere by pushing at the same old targets in the same old way as the BNP did and the National Front still does. What we have to do is to formulate new tactics which they will not expect, still aiming at the same goal that we've always aimed at, but aiming to do it in a different and unexpected way from a different and unexpected direction. And I would suggest that staying in Europe and turning Europe to our advantage to act as a lever on the British government against the British government's will is our best way forward. I therefore back item 1, the idea that we've come with a form of words which will replace British jobs for British workers and leave the European Union with something more subtle and something which I believe will have more immediate advantage to us. Thank you.